Okay, so let's get started. So welcome everybody. So this is our weekly Friday session on AWS user group India, and today's topic is we will be building a serverless URL shortener application. And for people who already know about me or have attended one of my sessions, you would have already known that I'm a big Marvel fan, comic book fan, cartoons, all those kinds of stuff. So I hope you guys are into something like that, because my presentations is pretty much towards it, and I try to tell a story. So let's get started. First of all, a bit of introduction about myself. So hello everybody, I am Srishit. I'm the co-founder and head of engineering at Confab. I hope a few people already know what Confab is. And I'm also a serverless consultant, co-organizer of one of the largest serverless meetup groups, that is the Serverless Architecture Meetup Group in Bangalore. So people who are interested into serverless are in Bangalore, they probably would know that. And I'm also a mentor at Girls Script Bangalore. So a brief introduction about myself. If you guys are interested about talking about serverless or anything related to AWS, you can always ping me on Twitter, LinkedIn, anywhere. I'm pretty much easy to find out actually. Yeah. So what are we going to do today? We are going to build a serverless URL shortener application. Sounds very big, but with the power of our advent of serverless, the advantage is you can do things quick, you can do things fast, cheap, easy, scalable. I mean, the advantages are so many. I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys have already known the introduction or the basics of what serverless is. So bringing all of those into picture and building an application end to end, minus the UI, because I'm a backend developer. So it's all going to be Postman and API calls and the AWS console. We will be building a simple application where you can post or you can request a shortened URL for a very big URL. I don't know how many of you have already used URL shorteners like Tiny or tiny.cc, bit.ly, and there are a bunch of other things, right? So we thought, why not build something for ourselves, which is very simple and straightforward. That is what we are going to build today. And the best part is, there are no Lambda functions at all. Yes, you heard that right. There are no Lambda functions, absolutely. Now you must be wondering, a serverless application without Lambda functions? Now should the application be called serverless in the first place because there are no Lambda functions? Well, I guess most of you would have already heard about this. Serverless doesn't necessarily mean Lambda functions alone. S3 is a serverless application service. DynamoDB. We have Aurora Serverless, which is a DB, which has the capability of serverless. So there are a lot of other services which is not just Lambda functions. So Lambda functions is the compute service that comes under the serverless umbrella. So yes, we can call an application as a serverless application even when there are no Lambda functions in it. What is the basic or how or what can classify as an application being called a serverless? It's pay as you go, where you pay for only how much you pay as you go for only how much you consume. That's pay as you go. And then we have the infinite scalability, which is again a star mark. So basically any serverless application should ideally scale to infinite without any configurational things. And it's easy to build and deploy. Now, there are going to be only two components for our serverless application. One is the API gateway. The other is the DynamoDB. That's it. There's no Lambda functions, as I've already told you. Isn't this exciting? I hope you guys are excited because I really can't see you guys. So let's get started. So the first thing is we'll just have a brief introduction to API gateway. then a brief introduction to DynamoDB, and then we'll just integrate API Gateway and DynamoDB and just play around with it. So today's session is almost no theory and everything is on hands-on. I will be actually building this application on the AWS console. And another disclaimer is basically this is an application, or the idea behind this is from Eric Johnson's session on building URL shorteners. There is a GitHub profile for the same, GitHub repository. I will be sharing the links towards the end of the session, and there's a resources page here as well where you can always go there and just check it out. So let's get started. As I've already told you, who's the star cast of the show? Who's the one that is running the movie for us? Two guys and a lady. There's an API gateway and there's a DynamoDB service. I'm pretty sure most of you would have used API gateway when it comes to serverless applications. So is DynamoDB, because DynamoDB suits very well. It's like they are made for each other, right? DynamoDB, a NoSQL database, which is a key value, and it just scales to infinite. You basically have to do nothing. And serverless or Lambda functions are the same, right? And you would have integrated to create APIs. Most of you would have used API gateway to integrate Lambda function. And then the Lambda function would talk to DynamoDB and then do some kind of a transformation, or write some data into DynamoDB, get some data, do some business logic, and return back to the client. This is our traditional application, right? So the client calls the API gateway is integrated with Lambda functions is integrated to a data source. In this case, it's DynamoDB. So just to put out the description or the definition of API gateway, I just wrote it down there. Amazon API gateway is a fully managed service and makes it easy for developers like us to create, publish, maintain, monitor, and secure APIs at scale. And there's a lot of other capabilities for it, like authorization, caching, custom domain APIs. We'll see if we can cover a few of those in this session. And then there's DynamoDB, which is a key value pair, a key value data store, document database that delivers single-digit millisecond performance at scale. And if you have worked on DynamoDB, the best part of DynamoDB is, one thing, it's NoSQL. The other thing is its performance, and its performance at scale. I don't know if most of you might already know that Amazon.com uses DynamoDB for its cart and all those things, which is very powerful, like the guy here. Strong, powerful, reliable, at scale, the most important part. And then there's API gateway, the lady who's calm. Most people, including me, when I was starting with API gateway, was just playing around with API gateway, connecting to Lambda functions, and that's it, done. I would never even look at what are the other services that API gateway is capable of. So API gateway is like this lady, calm, but you can use it how you want it. It's powerful, and it can show your power. We will see how powerful it is today. So that's about the star cast of the show, just two services, as simple as that. And obviously there are IAM rules, so we cannot do anything without IAM rules on the AWS cloud, right? So that's about it. So a quote. We have to start any presentation with a quote, right? So that you guys can take me serious. The best serverless application is the one that has 0 Lambda functions. Well, who said this? Captain Serverless. Very popular. If you guys are not aware of that, you should probably get to know. He's the latest entrant in the Avengers portfolio. As I said, I'm a big Marvel fan, so you'll probably get snippets or things correlating to the comic world or the Avengers thing. If you have attended one of my previous sessions, it's about how the Infinity Stones, that is from Avengers, and the Thanos wheels, that correlating with the Lambda functions. Now, let the magic begin. So I hope you guys are excited for doing this hands-on session. If you guys want to follow me, you can actually click on this link, conf.me/short. Well, it's a URL shortener application, right, that we are building. The URL also has to be short. That's the point with that. So I'm just switching over to the AWS console. So the moment you guys, if you guys want to follow what I'm going to do, you can just hit this URL conf.me/shard. You will land up on my GitHub repository. There's not much of a code because there's no code. We're not writing Lambda functions, right? So there's no code anyway. But there are a few things, that is the templates that we will be using. So these are the few template examples. I mean, the things that I will be using. So I just put them up here, which if you guys are trying to do along with me, you can always go to this repository and pick up the JSON templates from here. This is the VTL templates that will go inside the API gateways, mapping templates, and integration response, all those things. We'll take a look at that. Okay, so now, so if anybody is following me, just get onto the AWS console. So it would look something like this, and then switch over to API gateway, or rather, we'll just start with DynamoDB. That's our data source, right? Yes. Okay. Now we have the tables. Okay. So let's go ahead and create a new table. So what do we call this? I don't know. Shortener. We'll just call it a Shortener table. Yeah. I know most of you guys might be wondering, if you're starting with DynamoDB, my content said that it will have an introduction to API gateway and then introduction to DynamoDB. I thought while we do it, I'll explain things. So we don't really have to do a theoretical session, which I don't really like. Okay, so now we have the table name, that's the shortener. You can give whatever you want. And then the primary key. So as we already discussed, a DynamoDB is a key value data store. So you have keys, you have values. And then there's a concept of primary key, which is which you have to provide. I'm just going to provide it as an ID. This is the type. I'm going to leave it as a string. So this ID is nothing but our short ID. So as you saw that conf.me/short, that short in the link is this ID. So when you want to create a shortened URL, what is the shorter format of the URL that you want? So that is this ID. I don't want a sort key, and I would like to change the default settings. So this is a concept of secondary indexes. So what is secondary indexes? Secondary indexes are basically, it's an index, right? So there's an index on the table. So we're trying to create an index. So I'll just go ahead and create an index. So what is the primary key for the index? So if for people who have already worked on DynamoDB, this looks pretty straightforward. For someone who's getting started, a secondary index or a global secondary index is nothing but a new table with this index. So I'm going to have the key called owner. So that means my DynamoDB has 3 columns you can think of. One is the ID, which is the shorter form of the URL. The second is the owner, basically who owns the shortened URL, because our application, we want to deploy it and there'll be millions of users to use it, right? So who's the owner of it? And what is the longer form of the URL, right? And this is a NoSQL database. That means there's no schema, so I don't have to really define everything. So that's why I'm not going to define the longer URL. I'm just going to create a owner. And this is the index name. I'm just going to call it owner index. And what is projected attributes? So projected attributes is basically, you have a primary table, the main table, that is a shortener table. And as I told you, it is a global secondary index is like creating a new table altogether. Just that in the main table, the index is on the ID, whereas in the secondary table, that is the global secondary index table, it is on owner. And now this is what is basically, it's asking me projected attributes. So what all in the main table should also be present in this global secondary index table. I'm just going to leave it as all for now and just going to go ahead and create an index. Okay, so we created a we are creating a DynamoDB table along with a global secondary index. Now, why do I need a global secondary index? That could be a question, right? Now, the reason is later in the application, I would like to query based on the owners. So I would like to say, okay, if Srushit is logging in with his account, I have to probably have a dashboard where I will see all the links, the shortened links that I have created, right? So for that, we need, and for people who have already worked on DynamoDB, you can only query on primary key or primary key and sort key or on the indexes. That's a global secondary index. Now, since I have not kept the owner in the primary key of the table, I'm creating another index so that I can query on the owner's column or attribute. Now, read-write capacity mode, so I'm going to leave it as on demand. The best part of serverless is you don't have to take care of anything, right? So as and when requests come in, let the DynamoDB scale on its own. So that's this on-demand pricing. And encryption at rest, I'm just going to keep it default for now. We don't need any encryption per se. Okay, so now our table is being created. Okay, let's just give it a second. While it's getting created, let's go over to API gateway. So again, just like how we landed on DynamoDB, you just click on the services and search for DynamoDB. It's a managed NoSQL database. Oh, sorry, we already did DynamoDB. Yeah, this is API gateway. Click on the API gateway. We'll come here. Now, there are multiple APIs available here. For people who are starting now with API gateway, HTTP API is the new entrant into the API gateway services, like our Captain Serverless. He's pretty new. HTTP API is a faster, cheaper API, but obviously with lesser features. It's not a full-blown feature of what a REST API is. It's like a small brother of REST API, but it's much more cheaper and much more faster. We will not be using this today because HTTP API does not have a direct integration to other AWS services. It only integrates with Lambda functions as of now. So we hope we get that feature soon. Now, there's WebSockets. We are not going to do WebSockets. There's REST API and there's REST API private. So we'll just go ahead with the REST API that's public. Just click on build. Okay, let me just go over there and check. I have the items. Sorry, the table just got created. That's the Shortener table. And there is no data here as of now. Okay, create your first API. Yeah, I'm going to create my first API. So it's a REST API. And it's a new API. I don't want an example API. I know about API gateway. Okay, so what do we call this? Shortener API. You can call it whatever you want, nothing description. Endpoint type is basically, we are defining if this particular endpoint is going to be deployed regionally, that means deployed in the Sydney region, or is it going to be edge optimized? That is, it's going to be deployed across edge locations. I'm just going to keep it regional for now. Okay. Okay, what just happened? Oh, okay. I think the page did not refresh. Let me delete one of it so that we don't have any confusion. This is the Shortener API that we just created. Right now, again, for people who do not have prior knowledge of what API gateway is or what are the components of API gateway, we have something called as resources. That is what you see here. There's a resource created at the root structure, that is the slash that you have. And then you can create child resources or you can create resources. Let's go ahead and create a resource. I'm going to call it as an app, just whatever URL slash app. And I'm not going to enable CRS for now because there's no client accepting it. So I'm just going to leave it as is. Now, we created a resource and there's something called as methods. So there's a resource and there's a method. Oops, sorry, I'm creating another resource again. So under the app resource, I would like to create a method. Now, for building our application, what's the first thing? The first thing is you should have the capability to write the shorter URL and the longer URL into the database, right? So that means it's a post request. So let's go ahead and create a post request. Okay. Now you see the integration type. That is the Lambda function, HTTP mock APIs. Mock APIs are pretty helpful when you are just playing around and you have a UI. UI just needs a JSON response for them to build around it. A mock, that's a mock API. Then we have the AWS service. So most likely when I was getting started, so I was just not even worried about what these options were. I would always click on the Lambda function, just go here, type in the Lambda function and click on save, which is basically integrating an API with a Lambda function, correct? Now, it's time to take different turn. I don't want a Lambda function at all for my service. So I'm going to click on AWS service, which means that this API called /app for a method called post will be integrated with another AWS service. In our case, okay, so this is AP Southeast 2, that is Sydney. And then which AWS service? See, you have so many AWS services that we can integrate with API gateway. It's not just the Lambda functions. As I told you, API gateway might look simple, but it's very powerful. Now I'm going to integrate it with DynamoDB, and there's something called as HTTP method. So there are so many HTTP methods. It's going to be a post. One thing to remember here is when we are integrating API gateway with DynamoDB, it has to, must, should always be a post request, the HTTP method. It's not because I'm creating a post method here in the API gateway, but every operation from a DynamoDB, from gateway to DynamoDB is a post request. So that's why we call it as a post, and then use an action name. So what is the thing that we are going to do? We are going to update an item. Okay, for people who are not familiar with what DynamoDB or what DynamoDB things are, we'll explain that in a minute. Now there's something called as execution role. What is this? This is basically an IAM role that will be assumed by API gateway to talk to DynamoDB. But we have not created any IAM roles. So the first thing to do is go to the IAM console and create a role. So let's go to roles, click on create role. What kind of a service are we creating this for? It's an API gateway. We are creating an IAM role for API gateway. So select API gateway from the list of all of the services, click on next permissions, and now it will basically load the default policy that is a part of the API gateway. That is basically giving API gateway the permission to write to CloudWatch logs. Let's leave it as is. Click on next tags. I don't want any tags. Okay, I have to give it a name. Now what do I call this? Shortener read. And now the best practice with IAM is, or with the cloud for that matter, is provide granular security policies to your applications. There's always an option called a star, but we should never use a star. Star is basically provide access to all the services, all the methods, everything. But we are going to build a proper application, a good application, so we are going to keep it to the granular level. So I am going to create an IAM role just for read and another IAM role just for doing all the CRUD operations. Because for an API to read data from the DB, it does not need access to write or delete. Keeping the principles, best practices of IAM. So role to read data from DDB, the short form acronym for DynamoDB. Now just click on create role. Okay, now we can just go on this. Now we can see that there is only one permission. Now we have to attach permission. So basically this IAM role does not have access, does not have the policy to talk to DynamoDB yet. So we have to create that. There is a DynamoDB policy already available, that's the full access, but again, that's not a good practice. We have to provide fine-grained access. So I'm going to click on the create policy and it's going to open a new tab. where I'm going to add the policy manually. So what is the service that I'm going to use? I'm going to use a DynamoDB service. Now, in DynamoDB, what are the actions? There are so many actions available, but I want only read. In read, I'm just going to take batch, get item, query. Just the three of it. I don't want anything else because we're keeping it granular, right? I just want these three permissions, and then resources. What is resources? So basically this IAM, whoever has this IAM policy, what resources does this IAM policy have access to? We have to enter that. We have to enter the table name. Okay, what is the table name, or what is the region? It's AP Southeast 2. It's whatever region you guys are using. And then what is the table name? The table name, okay, I don't remember what I gave. Let me go here, copy paste it. Okay, done. We got that here. Okay, now we have added it. Now, you guys have to understand one more thing is we have created an index, a global secondary index. Now, this particular configuration that we have done gives this IAM policy only access to the table, not the index. So you see here, you have not provided any resource type for access, so we have to take this. So it is AP Southeast 2. The table name is Shortener. And what is the index name that we gave? It was owner index. Alright, done. If you guys want to see how it looks in a JSON format, this is how it's going to be. It's just providing these actions and on these resources. That's it. Now review the policy. Let's create a policy called as DDB read. Create the policy. Now the policy is generated. Now let's go back to the role creation part where we have to attach the policy to this particular role. Now DDB read. Obviously nothing will be there, but I have to refresh it once. Ta-da! DDB read. Attach the policy. Done. Now we have an IAM role that has access to DynamoDB table to read data from the table as well as the index. Let's go here. Now we were in the process of integrating API gateway with DynamoDB, and that's where we created the IAM role. Save. Okay, now that I don't know if you guys are actually I can't see you guys, right? I did a mistake. I did a read role for a post request. Post request has to write to the table, right? So yeah, that's a mistake. So we have to create another role that we decided. We'll create two different roles, one for read and the other for CRUD. So let's follow the same process. I'm just gonna call it DDB CRUD. I'm just gonna leave it. Done. Now let's go here, attach the policy like what we did for read. We will do the same thing, attach a policy, but now there is no policy already available, so I'm going to generate one policy now. Choose the service, Dynamo. What are the actions that we want to do? We want to do write actions on the DB. Right, so what I'm going to take is like I'm going to take batch write, put item, update item. There should be a delete item. So these are the ones that should be sufficient for us. Okay, now let's add the resources. Specific resource, add an ARN. So the one way of doing this is entering the details here. The other way is go to DynamoDB, go to overview. You will have the ARN already available. Just bring it up here, paste it, add, done. Review the policy. This is basically DDB CRUD policy. Okay, it's just creating a policy. Policy got created. Let's go back to the IAM role. Refresh it once. Yep, got it. Attach the policy. Super. Now we have another role that is responsible for writing data to DynamoDB. Done. It's very important for us to keep the IAM policies to the granular level so that there's no security violations. Yes, that's it. Now, we have provided access for DynamoDB, for API gateway to interact to DynamoDB. Correct? Now, if you scroll down, there's something called as mapping templates. And here we are going to add a new mapping template. Application/JSON. Give me a minute. I'll explain you what is happening here. Okay, let me bring this back here. As I told you, if you guys are following me, this is where the repository comes in to help. The templates, for the lack of time, I'll just copy paste it instead of writing it. So in the app, we have a post request. I'm just gonna quickly copy paste this. I'll explain you what this is. This is some kind of a JSON syntax. So I'll come back to this. Just give me a minute. I saved it. Let me go back. Before we get anything further, I would like to explain first this piece of the console. What does this mean? So here is the client and here is the DynamoDB, that is the data source. Now what happens is every time there's a request coming in, there is an interceptor here, that's the API gateway. There's a method request, there's an integration request. Before it reaches the service, API gateway has a capability to do a few things. That is what we are going to leverage today. And before reaching back to the client, after it came from DynamoDB, it again can do something. It can transform the data, it can add some data, it can delete some data. All of that capability is available in API gateway itself. Now, most people, what happens is they use Lambda functions to transport data from the client to DB. The whole point of this application is to shout out saying that you don't need a Lambda function to transport data from one place to another. AWS has services which are capable enough, intelligent enough to do it themselves. And this way we are eliminating an entire AWS service, but for the good, right? Now, integration request. So what this is, let me maximize this. Okay, now this is the thing. So what is an integration request? An integration request, if you guys remember the previous screen, is basically an interception before it actually reaches DynamoDB. So there is some input coming in. I'm transforming that input into a format that DynamoDB can understand and send it to DynamoDB. As simple as that. And now, for people who are familiar with DynamoDB, the syntax should be straightforward. I'm just going to copy the table name. This is the table name, Shortener. If you guys are following and if you guys are copying from the Git repo that I shared, just don't forget to change the table name. Now, what is a condition expression? Again, these are DynamoDB terminologies, nothing related to API gateway. So what is a condition expression? A condition expression is basically saying that if this condition satisfies, only then you execute whatever is happening here. If this fails, everything fails. You don't do anything. Now what we are saying is, we're just making sure that the shortened URL that is coming in the input is not already available in our database. We're just checking the attribute does not exist. That is the ID, which is nothing but the shortened ID that we are giving in the input. Now this is the key. Again, this is a syntax. You can just go to the DynamoDB documentation and you can understand. Key is basically the primary key. What was the primary key that we defined? It was ID. What type it was? String. Now what is the value of it? This is what is VTL syntax that we will be leveraging to transform data that is coming from the input via the API to a JSON like this before giving it to DynamoDB. Now, $input.json $.id. So there is an input called ID in the input. So just replace, this is a variable, right? So just replace this with that ID and string :ID. Now, there's something called as expression attribute names, expression attribute values. Before we go inside what this is, let me explain what this is. This is the SQL statement, like set this and this for this particular table, where this is the condition. For people who are coming from SQL world and pretty new to what DynamoDB or NoSQL is, this is how it happens behind the scenes. So we are setting U: O colon O, I'll tell you what these are. Hash. Hash represents attribute names. Colon represents the attribute values. So instead of me hard coding the values here, I'm using named variables. So hash u will be replaced by URL. Colon u will be replaced by this colon u. What is the value of this? Input.json $.url. Like what we did here, in the input, we will actually have three parameters. ID, that is the shortened part of the URL, the big URL, and who's the owner of the URL. So this one, we are currently accepting it from the input, but later, obviously will not be possible in this session. Most likely we can do another session where I'll talk about how to integrate Cognito as an authorization and authentication mechanism, where you don't accept the input from here, but you already know based on who's logged in. But for now, we'll just accept that also as part of the input. So U is the URL, O is the owner, and both of them are string types. I hope you guys have understood what this does. So it basically converts something like this, ID, and then owner, and then we have the URL. We will see this. It converts this into a syntax that DynamoDB can understand. Now, there could be scenarios where most of us, including me when I was starting, I used a Lambda function just to do this. The Lambda function would accept in the event an input like this, transform it into a DynamoDB object like this, and call the DynamoDB object using the SDK. Simple. But now we are eliminating that entire process by leveraging API Gateway. I hope you guys have understood what this is. And let me just go on save. Let me go back. Done. Now let us test it out. Let's see if whatever we have built is working or not. Okay, I have a very big URL. I don't know, I'm just gonna give it as HTTPS, or just say aws.amazon.com. And then who's the owner? Well, I'm doing it. I'm going to create it. I'm just gonna give my name. It can be name, email ID, whatever. I'm just gonna keep it as name for now, or let me just give as an email ID. This is not my true email ID. If you now, this is the ID. ID is basically what is the shorter format of what I want. Let's say I wanted to call it as AWS. Or yeah, I just want, or let's say because this is our first time, right? I'm just gonna call it as test, just to make sure. So what we are doing? We are saying that DynamoDB take these three things as the input and write it to it. That's all. We are not doing anything awesome here. Oh wow, I am lucky today. It worked the first time. Now you can see here, the status is a 200. Now this is the response. Attributes, ID called test, URL called this, owner called this. Now if we go back to DynamoDB table and go to this, go to items, just refresh this, ta-da, we have this. See, ID test, owner Srishit, URL is aws.amazon.com. Straightforward, right? How many of you have used a Lambda function just to do this? Including me, I have used this. Now, if you think about it, this is not something that is, not very readable by the client, right? This doesn't look so very neat and elegant. So that is where again API Gateway comes into picture. Instead of me directly returning what DynamoDB is sending, API Gateway comes into the picture and it says, let me do this. So there's a 200, if there is a 200 response, any 200 response for that matter, I'm just going to use a regex pattern, which is any 200 that comes in. Okay, there's a mapping template, there's an application/JSON. So if DynamoDB returns something with a status code as 200, now transform it into something that I can understand, that is what the client can understand. Again, I'm just going to go back to my existing thing. So post response, that is 200. I'm just going to copy paste it. I'll explain what this is. Let me do it right away. So whatever is coming in the input, from DynamoDB, I'm setting it into a variable called $input root. And this is a transformation. It says that send the output as ID URL owner, but the values are like this: input root dot attributes dot ID dot s, just like how we access JSONs, right? Dot dot dot. Input is whatever DynamoDB is sending us. Attributes dot URL dot s, attributes dot owner dot s. So this is basically the same format with which DynamoDB was sending us. Let's go back. Let's test again. Let me give another one. AWS UG. Okay, I don't remember the URL of AWS UG. I'm just gonna guess it. I know the Bangalore one though. Test. You see here? It got transformed. Earlier it was saying attributes, URL, S, blah, blah, blah. We just transformed it into something that our client can understand. I hope you guys are clear until what we have done. What we have done is basically we have given API Gateway the capability to talk to DynamoDB. And apart from that, we have also done some transformations. Basically, we are transforming the input into something DynamoDB can understand and transforming the output into something that the client can understand. This looks much more elegant, right? Now, this is fine. This is just storing the data in the DB. We have to test or make sure if our Shortener application is actually working, right? How do we do that? Go back to the API resources here, and I'm going to create a new resource. Please remember or please observe, this is I'm doing at the root structure, not under app. Okay, so yes, so I'm gonna call it link ID. And you guys must observe it's in curly braces. So what exactly does curly braces mean? It's a parameter, it's a variable. So API Gateway will understand that anything in this API that comes after slash should be passed into this resource. Okay, now let's create a resource. And obviously there's no client view consuming it, so I'm not having the gateway as cars, I mean enabling cars. Now this is going to be, we have to create a method. So this is going to be a get method because this has to be accessible by any browser, right? Same thing, instead of a Lambda function, it's going to be an AWS service. And this is AP Southeast 2, yes. What is a service? It's a DynamoDB service. Exactly same to what we did. Now, as I was mentioning, it's not, this HTTP method should always be post, and it is not dependent on what method we are using here, but it is always has to be post because it's an action on DynamoDB. It's a post action on DynamoDB. So this does not determine what HTTP method here is. Now, what is the action? It's actually a get item. And what is the IAM role? So we had created an IAM DDB read. Oh, this is the policy, I'm sorry. Oh, where did that go? Okay, I'm just going to type in read. Shortener read. My bad, I should have maintained the convention. Okay, Shortener read. Save. Now we have given the API Gateway capability to talk to DynamoDB and only read action. There's no delete or update or insert. Now the same thing, we have to transform the input, right? Because the input is coming as something. So you add a mapping template called as application/JSON, enter, okay, sorry, application/JSON, validation error, application, typo. Yep, done. Again, I'm just going to fall back into what I have already done. Okay, I'm just going to go to the linked ID get request. So just going to copy paste this here. So what we are doing is, this is again a DynamoDB syntax. You have to replace it with the DynamoDB table name that we created, not the one that I have provided. Now, what we are seeing here is in the input params, because as we said that link ID is basically an input parameter in the API Gateway. So that is the ID that we have to query from the DB, right? So take that ID and put it here, and this is the syntax for read or get item in DynamoDB. As simple as that. So we're saying go to this table, and in the primary key for a column or key called ID, fetch me whatever I'm asking in the this one API input. I'm just going to click on save. Let me go back. Now let us test it out. We gave it as test, right? Test. It is working. It gave me whatever I asked for. Now again, if my URL has to work, it is a 200 response. A URL shortener means what? If you hit this URL, it has to redirect to that particular website. I don't want a response like this. So basically, the status code should not be 200. It has to be a 301 or a 302, temporarily redirected or a permanently redirected status code, so that the browser can understand that it has to not consume this, but it has to redirect. So for that, we will be touching something called as method response. Here, it says a 200 response. I don't want a 200 response. I actually want a 301 or a 302, whatever you want. I'm just going to say 301. Enter. Now, if you click on this, I have to add a header called location. I hope that there's no typo here. So if you guys know how redirections work from a URL perspective, the response should have a 301 and it should have a header. In the value for the header called location is where the page will automatically get redirected. So we created a HTTP status code called 301 and created a header. Now we have to set this header. So there's a response from DynamoDB that is coming to integration response. Here we have to set the header called location to the response from DynamoDB. Let's go here. Again, this is not a 300 response, I mean 200. So let me just go ahead and delete it, add it. Now the regex. So again, I'm just going to keep it as let me see that the syntax is correct. Yep. So what this says is, whenever DynamoDB gives a status code of 200, map it to 301. 301 that we just created in the method response, right? If DynamoDB gives 200, map it to 301, and not just mapping. I have to transform it, right? So it's just like what we have been doing all the way along. Create an application /JSON. We get this, and again I'm going to rely on this, copy paste it. Let me explain. Now what the first line is, the first line sets a variable called input root is equivalent to the value that is coming from DynamoDB. And now what I'm doing is I'm going to get the thing called items. I hope you guys remember how DynamoDB returned. It said items. So in the input root, if there is items, then I'm going to set the context.response override.header.location. I'm just overriding the response header. And what header is it? It's a location header with what is coming from DynamoDB table. DynamoDB's response. Input root is DynamoDB's response dot item dot URL dot s. So this is the syntax. Let me just save it. Let me go back. Let me test. I hope I am lucky the second time also. Yes. You can see here it's a 301 response. You guys remember the last time we did the same thing, it was a 200 response. But now it's a 300 response. And if you see the response headers, there's no data, obviously. There's a 300 response, 300x. So here you see, in the location header, we have HTTPS. So the moment we hit this, let us try it out. Let's deploy this API. Let me deploy the API. I've never deployed anything. I'm just going to call it a dev deployment. Okay, now this got deployed. Copy this. You can either go to Postman or I'm good enough here because it's a GET request anyway. /est. Let's see if I'm third time lucky. Ta-da! Done. Our URL shortener application is done. We basically redirected from here some API gateway URL /dev/test to aws.amazon.com. It's as simple as that. we have just created our own Bitly. You don't have to no longer go there and create your own links on Bitly. You can do this. You can have your own analysis. You can have your own analytics, whatnot. It's as simple as that. This is just what we did was we created a new link. Let's go through what we did again. Let me go back to resources. This is the stages. Using the post request, there was an input, which basically was, let's create another one now. URL. Oh, we actually created one, right? Called AWS UG. Let me try that. I don't remember. Yeah, done. So it gets redirected to AWS UG Bangalore link. If you go back to our DynamoDB table, just refresh this. See, AWS UG test. I'm the owner for both of it, and these are the longer URLs. That's it. We have built our own Shortener application. Let us test out another link for us to brush out what we did. Okay, I know that this is a 1 hour session. I actually planned for creating update and delete as well, but I don't think we have time for that. But let me just quickly show you how to do a delete. Pretty simple, straightforward. Under app, I'm going to create another resource which is called as a child resource. So our API will be saying that /app/ for this ID, I want to delete it. Okay, so I'm just gonna call it as link ID. This is a parameter like we discussed. Create a resource. It's getting created. DDB CRUD. This is the IAM role. Now we have to create a method. So I want to implement delete. I don't want to have that test. Test is not good, right? I mean, there's a test data. Let me delete that. Delete. It's not a Lambda function. It's a DynamoDB service. AP Southeast 2 was the service. It's DynamoDB. It's always going to be post method. And this is a delete item. So for people who already know DynamoDB, these are the DynamoDB methods or actions that you can perform. And for people who are new, these are methods on DynamoDB that you can perform. Now, this is the IAM role. Save. While it's getting saved, I'll go back to my template. This link ID, delete this is the delete request. Yeah, it's getting saved. Transform the input into something that DynamoDB can understand. That is where we do the integration response. This is what it is. This is Shortener. There's no test. That's what I was doing. Let me quickly explain what this is. This is the primary key. That's the ID. You get the ID from the parameters in the API. This is the table name. What is the condition expression? I should not be able to delete someone else's thing, right? I should be able to delete if that belongs to me. So if the owner in the input is same as the owner in the DB for a given ID, only then delete. It's as simple as that. So input JSON owner. So I'm accessing the owner from the input, and I'm getting the link ID from the parameters. This is the expression. So this we already understood. Let me save. Let me go back. Test. I want to delete that test thing. And here I'm going to pass the owner. Test. Successful. 200. 200 was a success. Let's go to our DynamoDB table and let's see if test is there or not. Yoo-hoo! We don't have a test. We successfully deleted a shortened URL because we had the right permission for us to do it. Now, let me show you one last thing before I can just look into the questions which I have not been looking at all. We have the integration response, right? I would like to change that not just to 200. Let's say for whatever reason, I have a 400 request. That means I'm trying to delete someone else's shortened URL, or there's no short URL at all that I'm trying to delete. So that's a 400 request, right? So let me add a response that is a 400 response that I would like to give back to the UI saying it's a bad request. and go back. From the method response, I added a status code. In the integration response, I'm going to say that any 400 errors from DynamoDB, map it to a 400 on the method response, save. Let's go here. Let's go to the mapping templates, application/JSON, save. Now here, let me quickly go back here, delete 400 response. Yep. Save. So for whatever reason, if DynamoDB is throwing a 400 error, I would like to convey that back to the user. Let me test it. So I don't have test anymore, right? And I'm still the owner, but I don't have test anymore as a part of my DB. Done. It's a 400 request saying error. Either you don't have the permission to do this operation or the parameter is missing. That means this test is not a part of our DynamoDB table. Similarly, we can implement the put operation as well. We just go here, create a put, give permission to DynamoDB, do some transformation like I have already put here. This is a put request. The same thing. There's a table, there's a primary key details, expression attribute names and values, update expression, condition expression. Just making sure that I'm the owner of it and I'm updating the right ID. That is all from a put request on how we can update a particular a particular ID, a shortened ID on the DB. I'm just going to stop here because of the lack of time. I thought I could complete put also, but anyway, I'm sure we can always have another part 2 of the session where we can implement the authorization, we can implement caching. There's one last thing that I would like to complete before I stop. That is basically called as custom domain APIs. I don't know how many of you have already explored this piece. So what is a custom domain API? If you guys remember, we got a very big URL from API gateway, right? For us to pass it, I don't know. Okay, let me quickly hover there. Go back to API gateway, go here. Come on, go to stages, click on dev. This is such a big URL, right? I mean, the whole point of creating a shortened URL is to have a shortened URL, but this URL itself is very big, right? This is so big. Obviously, this part afterwards is smaller, but the URL itself is very big. It's much bigger than AWS UGBLR.in, right? How do I do this? If you guys remember, when we were starting the session, I gave you a link called conf.me/short. This is a custom domain that I own, that I have mapped to this particular, there's a particular API where I have mapped, and instead of using the API, I mean this domain provided by API gateway, if you go to custom domain names, we can create a new custom domain, just provide a domain name, provide the certificate, all those things, get it verified, and you will have a shortened URL like what I have provided. It's just that you should own the domain and you should have an SSL certificate. As simple as that. We have a very short URL, our own bit.ly or tiny.cc or whatnot. So that is all from my end. I will quickly just go to the presentation and see if there's something that I still have to complete. Yeah, this is the shortened URL. I hope we did some magic without Lambda functions. I'm a very big fan of Lambda functions, so we did something without it. So I'm really excited. I hope you guys were. Yes, that's it. So thank you so much, everybody. So if you guys have any questions, which I assume there are a few questions on this thing, I'll just go over there. But if you guys have to reach out to me anytime, you can just Google search my name. It's very easily findable. You can easily find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, GitHub, whatnot. Thank you so much. Let me just quickly go over and see if there are any questions. Okay, I don't know. I don't see anything here. Okay, I think that is it. Okay, I got a question. How I can upload the template directly from IDE to API gateway? Suppose in prod we don't have console access. Yeah, yes. So again, because this was a starter session, I did it from the console. But what we would be doing is we will either use a SAM template or a CloudFormation template where all of this is configured into a template and can be deployed. In fact, one of the links that I said I will be sharing actually has the entire application built on top of SAM, where SAM, I hope it's a serverless application model, a few of you might already know, where it's a wrapper around CloudFormation, very much specific to serverless applications and Lambda functions. So I can use that and I can just deploy it as a CloudFormation template. Now there are multiple other ways. So yeah, one second. So what I was saying. Yeah, there's again another thing called as the serverless framework, which I am a very big fan of. So you can use that as well. So the GitHub repository that I pushed, I have shared the link. So what I would be doing is I'll try to generate a serverless template, because the SAM template is already available. I don't have to regenerate anything. I'll try to generate a serverless template with all of this configuration so that you can simply go to your CLI command line and simply say serverless deploy, and you have your own shortener in place for you. So I think that is it. If there are any more questions, please do shoot. Okay, can I use Route 53 to map the domain to make it short? You can use Route 53 as well. So basically you would create a record set and you would integrate it with the API gateway as the alias, right? So that is what exactly happens when you use a custom domain API. So it's the same thing. So what will happen is it uses Route 53 behind the scenes, and it will create a record set for you, and then it will integrate the API gateway endpoint to that particular record set, and then you can do it. You can do it manually from Route 53, or you can just leverage what is available as a custom domain. I think that's it with the questions. So thank you so much for everybody who were a part of the session, and I believe this is being recorded and will be available for later streaming as well. So thank you so much for the AWS user group members, Partha in specific, to help me get this done, who has coordinated everything. And I hope we have built something that is exciting and helpful for you guys. And I hope the serverless Captain Serverless was happy with what we did. Signing off, Srishit here. Thank you so much.